Creation Evolution 3. It'll only be a short sharing because I can, shall we say, I can say what I've got to say in a very short space of time. Let's start with reading Genesis 1 and 2, please, Neville. Genesis 1 and 2.
In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. The earth was without form and void, and darkness was on the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters.
2 Peter 3, 5 and 6, please, Ross. 2 Peter 3, 5 and 6.
For this they wilfully forget that by the word of God the heavens were of old, and the earth standing out of water and in the water, by which the world that then existed perished, being flooded with water. Okay.
I trust you're going to get the point of those scriptures later on. We've all started with, or we've started this sharing with various quotes by evolutionists, and I want to do the same today. Let's take a sample of what they, what we've already quoted, and then go on with a couple of others. You've heard this before. Francis Crick, Life Itself, Its Origin and Nature, page 88. He says, an honest man, armed with all the knowledge available to us now, could only state that in some sense the origin of life appears at the moment to be almost a miracle. So many are the conditions which would have to be satisfied to get it going. Professor Jerome Lejeune, a lecturer in Paris in March 17, 1985, we have no acceptable theory of evolution at the present time. The neo-Darwinistic synthetic theory we know is bad. But because there isn't any other, this is what we teach. Professor R. Dawkins, the blind watchmaker, which we quoted last week in 1996, he says the only alternative explanation of the sudden appearance of so many complex animal types in the Cambrian era is divine creation. And we reject this alternative. No question, we just reject it. In P. Davis, Life Force, a New Scientist, 1999, how did stupid atoms write their own software? Nobody knows. There is no known law of physics able to create information from nothing. Sir Arthur Keith, Did Men Just Happen, in page 73. Evolution is unproved and unprovable. We believe it only because the alternative is special creation, and that is unthinkable. Let's go on with a few more quotes from notable evolutionists. Kevin Rodgen, The Eye of the Mankind, Smithsonian Books, page 22. The problem is that because we knew the end of the story, that is, evolution is true, we tend to interpret earlier events as if their sole purpose was to reach that end. D.M.S. Watson, Adaptation, Nature, Volume 123, page 223. Evolution itself is accepted by zoologists, not because it has been observed to occur or can be proved by logical, coherent evidence, but because the only alternative, special creation, is clearly incredible. How big is your God? Do you understand? What we're trying to do, or what these guys are trying to do, is put God in a box. And we understand that he is so great that he holds the stars in the palm of his hand. We have, this is a great problem with the church. They have reduced God to a matchbox, and then they say God is too small and they don't like him. It's ridiculous. In Kevin Roger, again, Bones of Contention, page 68, it is in fact a common fantasy, promulgated mostly by scientific profession itself, that in the search for objective truth, data dictate conclusions. Data are just as often moulded to fit preferred conclusions. Johnson Philip, Darwin on Trial, page 28. There is an important difference between going to the empirical evidence to test a doubtful theory against some plausible alternative, and going to the evidence to look for confirmation of the only theory that one is willing to tolerate. In other words, we're going to make everything fit into that, because that's the only theory we can tolerate. Now, last week we looked at the geologic column, only to find there is nowhere in the world that column exists. In fact, it only exists in textbooks that are keen to point out that evolution is true. No wonder one of the leading evolutionists says, and I quoted this before, H.S. Lipson, Professor of Physics, University of Winchester in UK, a physicist's look at evolution, Physics Bulletin, volume 31, page 130. I've given you every quote and exactly where it's from, so it's checkable. In fact, evolution became, in a sense, a scientific religion. Almost all scientists have accepted it, and many are prepared to bend their observations to fit with it. To my mind, the theory does not stand up at all. I think, however, that we must go further than this and admit that the only acceptable explanation is creation. I know that this is an anathema to physicists, as indeed it is to me. But we must not reject a theory that we do not like if the experimental evidence supports it. Interesting. Now, you have, sorry?
They don't have empirical evidence, do they?
No.
At all.
There's no empirical evidence.
No.
You know, one of the interesting things is to take all they say about evolution, and you can only accept that by faith.
But you can't test it.
You can't test it. There's nowhere that I can reproduce it in a test tube, in a laboratory. So, what's the difference between accepting that by faith and accepting God by faith? In fact, I think we have far more proof that God exists than evolutionists have of their theories.
There's a number of evolutionary theories as well.
Now, what I've done is I've produced for you the Miller-Urey experiment of 1953. Okay. Now, I think you may be lost. A is the vacuum line. Okay? If you'll see it up on the, here is the vacuum line. B is the voltage spark electrodes. C is the condenser with cold circulating water. Okay? So you say water in, water out, it's cold, so it condenses. D is the S-trap to prevent blowback or flowback. Yeah? E is the flask for boiling water and to collect reaction products. And F is the sealed tube opened later to remove reaction products for analysis. Okay? Now, that's the setup that they used, Miller-Urey. Now, in later experiments, the electrodes B were moved up into the larger flask at the upper right, and a stopcock for withdrawing reaction products was added. One of the great problems is Darwin himself didn't pretend to understand the origin of life. He confessed that he had no idea why there should be a plethora of evidence of animals appearing suddenly during the Cambrian era when there was no evidence of life at all in the pre-Cambrian era. Darwin himself speculated that life would have started in some warm little pond.
Is this the primordial soup?
I'm just about to get to that.
Sorry.
Okay. Russian scientist A.I. Oparin, together with J.B.S. Haldane, suggested in the 1920s that lightning in the primitive atmosphere could have produced the chemical building blocks of life. In other words, you came from a rock. Well, that's it. Water, splashing around on rocks, with a spark, produced you.
Where did the lightning come from?
They further hypothesized that chemicals produced in the atmosphere dissolved in the primordial seas to form a hot, dilute soup from which the first living cells emerged. The Oparin-Haldane hypothesis appealed to many scientists and thus became what science believes about the first steps in the origin of life. It was accepted generally that this was what science believes. This remained an untested hypothesis until the early 1950s, when an American graduate student, Stanley Miller, and his PhD advisor Harold Urey created some of the chemical building blocks of life by sending an electric spark through a mixture of gases they thought simulated the Earth's primitive atmosphere. And they did it with this stuff. Now, of course, Miller-Urey had to ascertain what they considered to be the Earth's primitive atmosphere. Today, our atmosphere consists of 21% oxygen. Yeah? And we assume that that's essential for life. Why?
Because we're here.
Because otherwise we die.
Yes.
Exactly. Paradoxically, life's building blocks could not have formed in today's atmosphere. Why?
There was no oxygen.
No, because oxygen causes
Carbon dioxide.
oxidation.
Oxidation.
Yeah. I mean, just cut a banana or an apple and leave it for a while and watch it go brown.
Brown, yeah.
It's oxidizing. Okay. This was the great problem. In 1952, Nobel Prize-winning chemist Harold Urey concluded that the early atmosphere consisted primarily of hydrogen, methane, ammonia, and water vapour. So what we had is a hydrogen, methane, ammonia, and water vapour. They reckoned that was the original atmosphere of the Earth.
Couldn't they get that from the snow core samples to prove it or not prove it?
Hold on, guys. That was what they considered to be the original atmosphere of the Earth. It's just as though Oparin and Haldane had postulated. Exactly the same as Oparin and Haldane had postulated. Miller assembled a closed glass apparatus, which you have the picture of, in Urey's laboratory. He pumped out all the air and replaced it with methane, ammonia, hydrogen, and water. Of course, had he not excluded the air,
Well, water's hydrogen and oxygen.
Yeah, but had he not excluded the air, his next step might possibly have been his last.
No.
Because it would have blown up.
No.
Boom.
Yeah. Mm.
I mean, you mix air with hydrogen, methane, ammonia. Good Lord. He then heated the water and circulated the gases past a high voltage spark to simulate lightning. After a week, Miller reported the water was deep red and turbid. Opaque, basically. He removed some for chemical analysis and identified, amongst other things, glycine and aniline. Two of the simplest amino acids found in proteins that do occur in living organisms. And he stated that we have proved that life began in the original atmosphere of Earth. The experiment caused an enormous amount of excitement among the scientific community of 1953 and soon found its way into every high school textbook and college textbook as evidence of the proof of the first steps of the origin of life. It's still there today. The Miller-Urey experiment is still featured in textbooks, magazines and television programs as a representation of evolution. Yet for more than 20 years, most geochemists have been convinced that the experiment failed to simulate conditions on the early Earth and could not have anything to do with the origin of life. Why did they think that? Do you know anything about valency? Do you know anything about hydrogen?
Well, only
It's a very, very, very light gas.
Yeah.
Therefore,
It would in the upper atmosphere.
it would be, it would waste to space.
As is methane. Methane's a white gas, isn't it?
Well, methane is a greenhouse gas.
Yeah.
But hydrogen would have dissipated to space, basically.
And water vapour.
So the whole thing was ridiculous. Okay? Now, I don't want to go into a long explanation of the supposed makeup of the atmosphere at the beginning of the Earth's formation. But to suffice to say that present scientists believe that Miller-Urey got it wrong. Of course, we believe that Miller-Urey and all the other scientists concerned got it wrong. Because we believe Genesis 1:1. In the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. That's it. Returning to our secular scientists, Sidney Fox and Klaus Dose stated that not only did the Miller-Urey experiment start with the wrong gas mixture, but also it did not factually represent any geological reality. Most science journals have stated that since 1977, this view has become a, shall we say, let's say that again, because my notes are not right. Most journals, science journals, have stated that since 1977, this view has become a near consensus among geophysicists. In other words, they agree with the guys I just said, Sidney Fox and Klaus Dose. John Cohen wrote in 1995, many origin of life researchers now dismiss the 1953 experiment because the early atmosphere looked nothing like the Miller-Urey simulation. I can go into why, but it's a long explanation which I don't really understand everything. Okay.
They don't know what was there.
No, I've no idea.
No idea.
I would suggest that seeing as God made animals, he had to make the grass before the animals, yeah?
Exactly.
Okay? And for anyone who thinks that Yom is a period of time,
They're not.
we have Psalms, which says, in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth. So, that sorts it out.
It talks about a day and a night, doesn't it?
Right. Any questions? Haeckel's embryos. You've got a picture. Like that. Yeah? Okay. The bottom part, embryos and evolutionary history, drop for the moment. Just have a look at the Haeckel's embryos. Regretfully, Haeckel was trying to prove that all embryos were the same. So what he did was he basically drew all the embryos and he produced them in this format, like that. And they look very much the same. Yeah. Regretfully, Haeckel fudged his drawings. To highlight the similarities between embryos. Not only that, he also altered their size. So they all appeared to be the same. By the way, just in case you realise, you don't know, this appears in science textbooks today. Now, I want to quote, because that's all I can do. The New Scientist writes in January 2015. It's embarrassing but true. Some of the most influential drawings in the history of biology are wrong, exaggerated to fit a thesis. As we discover in Haeckel's embryos, German biologist Ernst Haeckel included illustrations of the embryological stages of vertebrates in a series of books published between 1868 and 1908. Fudging the data, he placed the drawings into a comparative grid, highlighting similarities between species and blurring differences. The results are highly inaccurate. This is not me, this is the New Scientist writing, I'm quoting. Haeckel wanted to convince his readers that all vertebrates share a common ancestor, and that, as he put it, ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny. Now, you all understand that. Ontogeny, I'm sure I'm right. No, it's, I don't know how you say it. Recapitulates phylogeny. Yeah? Embryonic development recapitulates evolutionary past. Evolutionary past. Embryonic development recapitulates evolutionary past. That's what it means. Okay? This axiom, aphorism, was soon disproved, but the use of Haeckel's drawings persisted, particularly in education. There were waves of criticism from 1870s, when the drawings were published, up to 1997, as Haeckel's fraud was rediscovered and exploited by creationists. In his sumptuous book, Nick Hopwood, a science historian, examines how and why Haeckel made his drawings, and the use made of them since. His clever detective work takes him into the Haeckel archives in the German town of Jena, discovering the original drawings and even the woodblocks. At the end of the story, he explores how Haeckel's drawings appeared in post-war textbooks in the UK and in the US. Stunning illustrations show the way the images have been copied and reinterpreted from the late 19th century on. And insights from writers shed a fascinating light. For example, Scott F. Gilbert, author of a 1985 developmental biology textbook, inadvertently uses Haeckel's images. Your kids are learning this. I want you to understand. Ironically, although Haeckel's drawings are used only as relics now, no they're not, modern molecular genetic studies show his fundamental point. Your other picture. That there are important similarities between different vertebrate embryos seems less mistaken, even though his diagrams are profoundly wrong. In other words, they're trying to turn around and say Haeckel's drawings are wrong, but the point he was making was right. Hopwood's excellent thought-provoking book makes us ponder how these erroneous illustrations acquired their iconic status, and above all, it shines a spotlight on the power of drawings to influence our thinking. End of quote from The New Scientist. January 2015. Amazing that they felt that they should quote that in 2015 when they were the turn of the century before. The fact that it is still in school textbooks and being fed to your children. However, the New Scientist was correct in their opening sentence. It's embarrassing but true. Some of the most influential drawings in the history of biology are wrong, exaggerated to fit a thesis. In other words, die. Romans 1:22.
Professing to be wise, they become fools.
This is the great problem. We've got these great men of science who think themselves wise, and they demonstrate how foolish they are. One of the periodicals I can recommend to you is CMI. They are brilliant, and brilliant. 90% of them contain a scientist who believes in creation. And all your original scientists, really going back, believed in creation. That's why they were scientists. Okay, any questions? Before I go on, any questions? Okay, let's have a look. Now, I can never say this. I've got it wrong. Archaeo. Opteryx.
Which means first wing.
That's what it means. Okay.
What, sorry?
First wing.
First wing.
Oh, right.
When Charles Darwin published The Origin of the Species in 1859, he acknowledged that the fossil record was a serious problem for his theory. He wrote the following, and I quote, "By the theory of natural selection, all living species have been connected with the parent species of each genus by differences not greater than we see between the domestic varieties of the same species at the present day. As a consequence, the number of intermediate and transitional links between all living and extinct species must have been inconceivably great." End quote.
Are you talking about his tree? Darwin's tree?
Well, what he's saying is that all these come from a common ancestor.
Yeah, the tree. Darwin's tree, wasn't it?
Yeah. And yet, these are fully formed.
Yes. So when they found
So there must have been some
links in the middle.
links here.
Yes. The trouble is, his tree got enormous.
Yes. His tree got very enormous.
And he,
But he didn't have any of these.
no. But
None at all.
when they found that, what was that, the 1850s or something?
Hold on. Don't preempt.
Sorry.
I mean, I've worked for this.
No. But Darwin's tree is just silly, isn't it?
Yeah, of course. As people say, all these lines,
Got the line.
that's art.
Yeah.
In 1859, these transitional links had not been found. Darwin attributed their absence to the imperfection of the genealogical record. He argued that most organisms were never preserved, or if preserved, were subsequently destroyed, so that, quote, "We have no right to expect to find in our geological formations an infinite number of these transitional forms which, on our theory, have connected all the past and present species of the same group into one long and branching chain of life. We ought only to look for a few links." End quote. 2 years later, in the midst of heated controversy over Darwin's theory, came a dramatic announcement. A missing link has been found. And I hope somehow to deal with that next week.
I remember David Attenborough talking about that, doing a study on it.